If you're watching this, you're probably not too happy about how things have gone in the world for the past 100 years or so. And I can't blame you, so we're going to try and make you feel a bit better about things, aren't we, Margaret?
Yeah, sure, whatever.
Yes, now, the 20th century starts about 14 years too late, actually, in 1914, on a sunny Sunday. I'll leave a source in the description that it was sunny, very sunny. Now, the events on this day kind of determine everything that will happen in the 80 years or so afterwards. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about what happened on this sunny Sunday. But first, let's look at this map, because this map summarizes the, let's say, tense political situation in Europe quite well, and two actors in particular stand out. First, there's Germany, which is the only one that's in conflict on two sides. Germany had only relatively recently become unified and had grown to be a threat to pretty much everyone. Really, you could say both world wars were essentially just attempts by Germany to make something of itself, of all its potential. Then the other actor to look at in the map is Russia, which at the beginning of the 20th century was very underdeveloped compared to its European neighbors, and so also not seen as much of a threat yet. But everyone realized though, and especially the Germans, that it would just be a matter of time before this gigantic nation would industrialize and in the long run become a significant threat. Now, this whole situation led to a pretty insane German military doctrine called the von Schlieffen Plan. The plan's primary goal was to prevent the Germans from having to fight on both fronts at once. And so the plan was all about a very quick mobilization of armed forces in the case the Russians would mobilize. And then, who would they attack in case of Russian mobilization, Margaret?
I would hope no one.
That's right, the French. If Russia mobilized, the German plan was to immediately mobilize as well and attack France through Belgium. The reasoning behind this was that the Russians would be so demented that they would need at least 6 weeks before they could fully mobilize and enter any conflict, in which time the Germans would already have defeated France and turned around to the east to then deal with Russia. If you ever made a plan that didn't quite work out as expected, I promise you it still worked out better than this von Schlieffen Plan ever did. Anyway, there's much more to say about this whole situation, but I think this is enough to give you an idea of the general fun vibes in the European political elites back at the beginning of the last century. Now, back to that sunny Sunday I was talking about. I was referring to the 28th of June in 1914, when the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, decided to go on a little visit to Sarajevo, capital of the Bosnian province, where a few young Serbian radicals took the opportunity to assassinate him. The man who ended up killing him, Princip, was only 19 years old. Really, it was just a few young students who had come up with this idea, although they managed to get some support in the form of weapons and training from a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand. It was really their own initiative. Also, this group, by the way, the Black Hand, was also called Unification or Death. So you can really get what kind of people these are from this type of naming. Although I imagine to the young students that carried out the attack, it must have seemed somewhat romantic, perhaps. There's always an element of romanticism in any radical movement, isn't there, Margaret?
If you say so.
Anyway, these young Serbian, what shall we call them, nationalists, terrorists, depending on your viewpoint, these young romantics had set themselves up along the route that the Archduke would take on his visit to the town hall in Sarajevo. And you can find very nice little maps, actually, across the internet of the events on that day, because the events on this day were very, very messy, or chaotic, I should say. There was a first attempt at throwing a bomb at the car en route to the town hall, which missed. Then there was some very good decision-making, I have to say, on the part of the Archduke's team, like taking the exact same route back from the town hall on which they were bombed, even though that wasn't in the original planning. And then there was a wrong turn taken on this route back, after which they had to go back in reverse. And the car stalled right in front of, you guessed it, Princip, who then took his shot. Now, this assassination set in motion a chain of events so unfortunate that I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any comparison in all of history. I won't go into the specifics too much here, but essentially from the Austrian point of view, this crisis was an opportunity to be exploited to blame and attack Serbia and gain more control over the Balkans, which they had been competing over with the Russians. The Russians then mobilized in response, and I already told you what the German genius plan was of how to respond to any Russian mobilization. So this is the start of the 20th century. And everything that'll happen in the 20th century goes back to this. World War II is just a consequence of World War I. The communist revolution in Russia will be a consequence just 3 years after Prinkipp's bullet. The rise of fascism in Europe, all the way to the Cold War. Everything goes back to this. Now, there are generally 3 stages you go through in your level of historic maturity, let's say. There's the first stage at which you say, oh, if only Prinkipp had not pulled that trigger. Then there's the second stage, where you say that the state of European affairs was such that if it hadn't been Prinkipp, it would have been some other random occurrence and that some type of conflict was coming anyway. This second stage in particular gives you some comfort, doesn't it? In the knowledge that large historical events are caused by large structural processes on which these random little things don't have much of an impact. Anyway, I'm here to bring you to the third stage, together with Margaret, of course.
Of course.
Let's start by asking a simple question. Could anyone have predicted everything that would end up happening as a result of this assassination? Now, of course, your immediate answer would be no, because history is a very complex, dynamic system, you would say, which is very hard to predict, much like the weather. But what if you had all the information in the world? What if you knew the precise location and momentum of every atom? Would you not then be able to predict the weather, or history, or anything really? After all, isn't everything governed by mathematical laws of nature? Wouldn't you then be able to determine everything through a bunch of action and reaction steps? This question is not new, and is commonly known as Laplace's demon. You can look that up online and you can find 1,000 different ways to answer this or even to interpret this. You could even go into the irreversibility of thermodynamics as one example of an answer, but here I will give you the best, the cleanest, and the most elegant answer to this question. In my explanation, I'll temporarily be stepping away a bit from history and Prinkipp and all that, down to a, let's say, simpler setting, but I promise you it will all make sense at the end, and I also promise that Margaret is very excited.
I think they can tell.
All we need for this answer is a little pendulum. You could even do this at home. On the floor, place 3 magnets equally far apart from each other, and above them, put up a pendulum with a magnet at the end of it as well. Here in the schematic, you see 3 magnets on the floor, a yellow one, a blue one, and a red one, and a black magnet hanging over them on the end of the pendulum. Now, if you grab the black magnet at the end of the pendulum and just move it a bit and then let go, it'll start swinging, and it will be pulled here and there by all the magnetic forces going on, and eventually, since these things are all attracting each other, it'll end up at one of the 3 magnets on the floor. I would have loved to film myself doing this at home, but there are no magnets where I live, so I decided to just simulate it on my computer instead. I am able to simulate it because the natural laws that determine the movement of the pendulum are completely known. They're deterministic, and in case you're interested, can be expressed mathematically with these 2 differential equations. Where the pendulum will end up is completely determined by its starting position. So if you change the starting position, you change the outcome. You can see the starting position as a different initial condition that sets off a different chain of events, just like Prinkipp's bullet set off a chain of events. So if Prinkipp misses his bullet, we end up at a different outcome, a different magnet. So let us ask then, for each starting position, at which magnet would I end up? I'll run the little simulation on my computer as before, but now I'll color in the little square where the pendulum started with the color of the magnet it ends up at. Okay, so I've colored in 400 squares here, a grid of 20 by 20. But what if I made my squares a bit smaller? That is, what if I'd be more precise with my measurement? Instead of swinging the pendulum from 400 different locations to see for each one where it will end up, I'll swing it from, let's say, 2,500 locations, a grid of 50 by 50. Now an interesting pattern is emerging, isn't it? And I can sense you are being tickled with curiosity for me to increase the precision even more. I know Margaret is.
I hope your computer can handle it.
Here I have increased it to 10,000 squares. a grid of 100 by 100. There's clearly a pattern here, but as you go more to the edges, it seems very chaotic, and I can hear you asking for an even higher precision, so let's do a grid of 200 by 200, which is 40,000 little squares. Who would have thought this pendulum would generate your new desktop wallpaper? It's very cool, and clearly it seems like we've uncovered some hidden secret of the universe. But still, when I look at these areas near the edge, it's still too chaotic for me and not precise enough. I still wouldn't be sure of where the pendulum would end up if it started over there, even though I'm starting from quite a precise point in the space by now. So I think it's time to blow up my PC and zoom all the way in. Margaret, put on some more appropriate music, please. So, if you haven't gotten the gist yet, this will go on forever. And I mean literally, mathematically, forever. It's not a matter of my computer's precision. You can zoom in infinitely far and you'll never find clear boundaries where these colors touch. And I know what you're thinking. How can this one-dimensional boundary line be infinitely complex like this? Well, the boundary line is not one-dimensional. Nor is it a two-dimensional surface. It's somewhere in between, like 1.4 or something. Its dimension is a fraction. In a sense, it's so complex that it's spilling over into a higher dimension. These kind of things turn out to be very common in nature, hence why you already run into one just when swinging a little pendulum back and forth. They're called fractals. Now, if we go back to Laplace's demon, would he be able to predict where the pendulum would end up, given a starting position that lies in this fractal? After all, the demon knows everything, right? He knows the exact starting position, and he can just apply the equations to get to his prediction. But what is the exact starting position? Any answer you give to that would not be precise enough for a prediction in this case. The demon can never have enough knowledge to determine a boundary between where the pendulum will end up at this magnet and where it will end up at that magnet. It's quite paradoxical, really, because this is a completely deterministic system. There is no randomness in here, no probability. Yet still, for these regions, you can't predict where the pendulum would end up. In mathematics, this is called chaos, a system that is so sensitive to its initial conditions that even though it's deterministic, it's unpredictable. Here's an example where I start two pendula from almost the exact same position. This chaos is everywhere in nature, and history itself is a chaotic system. The tiniest shift in initial conditions, like Prinkiep choosing to stand somewhere else, or the Archduke choosing to take a different route back from the town hall, and you might not have had a communist revolution in Russia or the Nazi regime in Germany. Not only that, but it would be impossible to predict what you would have had, even if you had all the knowledge in the world. Of course, there were clear historical trends, like some type of conflict in Europe was to be expected, as I laid out in my opening. But there is no reason whatsoever to assume that the way this conflict ended up playing out looks anything like what it would have looked if Prinkiep hadn't fired his bullet. If anything, I think the route our pendulum took is probably one of the more unfortunate ones, given that we ended up with a group of people whose logo is literally a skull and crossbones in charge of the technologically most advanced European nation. And this then, finally, is the third stage of historical maturity, which you have now reached thanks to me and Margaret, and you're welcome. It's the understanding that large historical events can be caused by tiny little insignificant things, and that it's impossible to predict anything within this chaotic system, no matter how much knowledge you have of the state of things. I hope you feel better now.
So much better.